A millionaire and an unknown black man are terminal patients. When they met, he had no idea that, "Hello, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any stories." The afternoon sun seeped through the curtains of the hospital room, casting long shadows over Jonathan Blackwell's tired face. The 62-year-old billionaire watched the city of Boston from his window, his blue-gray eyes reflecting the brilliance of the skyscrapers he himself had helped to build. Despite the luxury that surrounded him, Egyptian cotton sheets, state-of-the-art medical equipment, and a team of private nurses, Jonathan felt emptier than ever. "Mr. Blackwell," the nurse's soft voice interrupted his thoughts. "We have a new patient arriving in the next room. I thought you should know." Jonathan nodded distractedly, turning his gaze to the window. What did another patient matter? Nothing would change the fact that he was dying, alone, surrounded by all the money in the world, but with no one to really care. In the corridor, the buzz increased. Excited voices and the sound of approaching wheels broke the sepulchral silence of the VIP floor. Jonathan turned around, intrigued despite himself. "Hey guys, watch out for that bend," a cheerful, gruff voice echoed down the corridor. "I don't want to end up in the wrong room and scare some rich guy, you know." Laughter followed the comment, and Jonathan found himself smiling involuntarily. Who was this man who could bring so much life to such a gloomy place? Moments later, the door to the next room opened, and Jonathan heard the sound of a bed being positioned. Curiosity consumed him, but he resisted the urge to call the nurse for information. The hours passed slowly. Jonathan dozed off, woke up in pain, and tried to distract himself with the TV, but nothing seemed to fill the emptiness that consumed him. Then he heard a moan coming from the next room. Without thinking twice, Jonathan pressed the call button. When the nurse appeared, he asked, "Please check that the patient next door is all right." Minutes later, the nurse returned. "He's fine, Mr. Blackwell. Just a little discomfort. In fact, he asked if you'd like some company." Jonathan hesitated. It had been years since he had really interacted with someone outside his business circle. But something in that cheerful voice intrigued him. "Tell him he can come," he finally replied. The door opened, and a middle-aged man walked in, pushing his IV stand. His skin was dark and marked by the sun, with wrinkles of expression that spoke of a life full of smiles. His brown eyes shone with a vitality that contrasted sharply with the gloomy atmosphere of the hospital. "What's up, neighbor?" The man smiled, holding out his hand. Jamal, Washington. I heard you were here alone and thought I'd say hello." Jonathan hesitated for a moment before shaking the offered hand. "Jonathan Blackwell," he introduced himself, surprised by the firmness of Jamal's grip. "So, Jonathan," Jamal said, pulling up a chair and sitting down with a groan of relief. "What does a guy like you do in a place like this?" The question, so simple and direct, took Jonathan by surprise. For a moment he considered giving his standard answer, something vague about health complications, but something in Jamal's frank gaze made him hesitate. "Cancer," he finally replied, the word heavy on his tongue. "Terminal stage." Jamal nodded, his smile softening but not disappearing. "That makes two of us, brother. Looks like fate put us side by side for a reason, huh?" Jonathan found himself smiling back, a strange sensation after so long. "Maybe," he replied, surprising himself. "Maybe I really did." As the sun set over Boston, casting a golden glow over the two men, something changed in room 501 of Massachusetts General Hospital. An unexpected connection began to form, one that would defy expectations and change two lives forever. Dawn brought a new energy to Massachusetts General Hospital. The first rays of sunlight seeped through the windows, illuminating Jonathan Blackwell's room. The billionaire had been awake for hours, his mind restlessly going over the previous night's conversation with Jamal. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," Jonathan called, expecting to see a nurse. To his surprise, it was Jamal who entered, pushing a wheelchair. "Good morning, neighbor," he exclaimed, his infectious smile lighting up the room. "How about breakfast overlooking the Charles River?" Jonathan hesitated, His morning routine usually consisted of reviewing emails and making business calls, but something in Jamal's hopeful expression made him reconsider. "Why not?" he replied, surprising himself. Minutes later, the two men were on the hospital terrace, cups of steaming coffee in their hands, watching the river meander through Cambridge. "You know," Jamal began, breaking the comfortable silence, "I grew up in Dorchester. I passed through here every day on my way to work, but I never imagined that one day I'd be drinking coffee with a view like this." Jonathan looked at his new friend, intrigued. "Are you from Dorchester? It must have been challenging." Jamal laughed, a deep, genuine sound. Defiant is a fancy word for it. But you know what? I wouldn't trade my childhood for anything. I learned more on the streets of Dorchester than any university could teach. The billionaire frowned, confused. "But surely you wanted something more." "More?" Jamal repeated, his eyes shining. "Jonathan, my friend, I had everything. I had a community that cared, neighbors who looked out for each other. We had little, but we shared so much." Jamal's words hit Jonathan like a punch in the stomach. He thought of his own childhood on Beacon Hill, surrounded by luxury, but often lonely. "Tell me more," Jonathan asked, genuinely curious. Jamal smiled, delving into his memories. "I remember the Sunday barbecues in the street. Everyone brought something. Mrs. Rodriguez made the best tamales you've ever tasted. Old Joe brought his saxophone. We'd spend the afternoon eating, dancing, laughing." As Jamal spoke, Jonathan found himself transported to a world completely different from his own. A world of laughter, music, and genuine connections. "And you, Jonathan?" Jamal asked, bringing the billionaire back to the present. "What was your childhood like in, let me guess, Beacon Hill?" Jonathan laughed humorlessly. "That obvious?" "Well, that watch you're wearing probably costs more than my house," Jamal joked, no malice in his voice. Jonathan looked at his Patek Philippe, feeling suddenly ashamed. "My childhood was comfortable," he began, choosing his words carefully. "We had everything money could buy, but something was missing," Jonathan admitted, surprised at his own honesty. "My parents were always busy, building the empire. I spent more time with nannies and chauffeurs than with them." Jamal nodded, understanding. "You know, Jonathan, wealth isn't just about money. It's about connections, experiences, shared moments." Jamal's words echoed in Jonathan's mind, making him question everything he had ever valued. "Maybe you're right," he murmured. "Hey," Jamal said, putting a hand on Jonathan's shoulder, "it's never too late to create new memories. How about we start now?" At that moment, watching the sun reflect on the waters of the Charles River, Jonathan felt something he hadn't experienced for years. Hope. "What do you have in mind?" he asked, a genuine smile forming on his lips. Jamal smiled back, his eyes sparkling with mischief. "Well, I hear the cafeteria is serving pancakes today. How about a competition to see who can stack the most?" Jonathan laughed, the sound surprising them both. "You're talking to the East Coast contract stacking champion, Jamal. Prepare to lose." As the two men headed back inside the hospital, laughing and making plans, Jonathan realized that, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about his illness or his business. He was simply living in the moment, and it was wonderful. The sound of laughter echoed down the hospital corridor, something unusual on the palliative care floor. Jonathan and Jamal were returning to their rooms after the pancake stacking competition in the cafeteria, which had ended in a hilarious and sticky draw. "I can't believe you actually tried to use syrup as glue," Jonathan said, wiping tears of laughter from his eyes. Jamal shrugged, a mischievous grin on his face. "Hey, nobody made rules against that." When they reached their rooms, they both hesitated, reluctant to end the moment of joy. It was Jamal who broke the silence. "You know, Jonathan, this morning got me thinking. We're both here, with limited time ahead of us. What would you say to making a wish list?" Jonathan frowned. "A wish list? You mean like The things we want to do before we die? Exactly, Jamal exclaimed, his eyes shining with enthusiasm. Come on, man. There must be things you've always wanted to do, but never had the time. The billionaire reflected for a moment. His life had been so focused on building his empire that he would barely allow himself to dream of anything beyond that. I don't know, Jamal. I'm not sure there's anything I really— Rubbish, Jamal interrupted, pulling Jonathan into his room. Everyone has dreams, my friend. Let's dig up yours. For the next few minutes, Jamal scoured the room for pen and paper, while Jonathan watched, a mixture of amusement and apprehension on his face. Here, Jamal said, handing Jonathan a pen and holding up a notepad. You start. What have you always wanted to do, but never done? Jonathan hesitated, the pen hovering over the paper. Slowly, almost timidly, he began to write. 1. Learn to cook. See the Grand Canyon. 3. Swimming with dolphins. See, that wasn't so hard. Jamal smiled encouragingly. My turn now. With enthusiasm, Jamal began to list his wishes. 1. Parachute jump. 2. Visit New Orleans during Mardi Gras. 3. Learn to play the saxophone. As the list grew, Jonathan was surprised by the simplicity and boldness of Jamal's wishes. They were things that he, with all his money, could easily have done, but never considered important. How about this? Jamal suggested, his eyes twinkling. Have a community barbecue in Dorchester, like in the old days. Jonathan hesitated. I don't know if I'd fit in at something like that, Jamal. Nonsense, Jamal exclaimed. You'd be the guest of honor. Besides, nobody makes a hamburger like Aunt Rosie. Trust me, you'll love it. Slowly, a smile formed on Jonathan's face. The idea of trying something so far out of his comfort zone was both frightening and exciting. All right, he agreed. Let's add it to the list. As they continued to fill out the paper, the atmosphere in the room changed. The heavy air of a hospice was replaced by an energy of hope and possibility. Do you know what else we should add? Jonathan suggested, surprising himself. A hot air balloon ride at sunrise. Jamal smiled broadly. Now you're getting into the spirit of the thing. When they finally finished, the list contained an eclectic mix of adventures, cultural experiences, and simple but meaningful moments. It was a testament to two different lives coming together, sharing dreams and aspirations. So, Jamal said, looking at the list with satisfaction, where do we start? Jonathan looked out of the window, observing the movement of the city outside. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine all the possibilities the list represented. Turning to Jamal, he smiled, a glint of determination in his eyes. How about we start with the nearest one, he suggested. There's a cooking course at the Boston Public Market this afternoon. What do you say we take the first step on my culinary journey? Jamal laughed, a sound full of joy and anticipation. I think that's a brilliant idea, Chef Blackwell. As they made plans for their first adventure, Jonathan felt something he hadn't experienced for years. The thrill of the unknown, the joy of having something to look forward to. The wish list wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a promise of life, a chance to rediscover the joy in the little things and the big adventures. And so, in a hospital room in Boston, two men from completely different worlds began a journey that promised to transform not only their last days, but their entire perspective on what really matters in life. The aroma of fresh herbs and exotic spices filled the air of the Boston Public Market kitchen. Jonathan Blackwell, dressed in an immaculate white apron, looked apprehensively at the array of ingredients in front of him. Next to him, Jamal Washington smiled, clearly amused by his friend's nervousness. Relax, Johnny, Jamal said, patting Jonathan on the back. It's just food, not rocket science. Jonathan cast a wry glance at Jamal. Speak for yourself. The last time I tried to cook something more complex than toast, I nearly set my roof on fire. The instructor, a renowned chef called Antonio, began the class by demonstrating how to cut vegetables. Jonathan watched intently, his hands, used to signing million-dollar contracts, now trembling slightly as he held a kitchen knife. "Remember," Antonio said, "cooking is about passion, not perfection. Feel the food, connect with it." Jamal, who seemed to be in his element, was already chopping onions with the dexterity of a professional. "See, Johnny? It's like fixing an engine. You need to feel the parts, understand how they fit together." Jonathan took a deep breath and started chopping a tomato. To his surprise, as he concentrated on the task, he felt an unusual calm come over him. The world outside, with its worries and pressures, seemed to disappear. As the lesson progressed, the two friends found themselves immersed in the preparation of a wild mushroom risotto. Jonathan, to his own surprise, found that he was enjoying the process. The act of slowly stirring the rice, adding stock little by little, had something meditative about it. "You know," Jonathan said, as he added a pinch of salt to the pot, "I never thought I'd say this, but this is relaxing." Jamal smiled, adding mushrooms to his own pot. "That's what I'm talking about. Cooking is like life, Johnny. You have to be patient, pay attention to detail, and sometimes improvise a little." As the aroma of risotto filled the air, Jonathan found himself reflecting on Jamal's words. How many times in his life had he really stopped to feel the moment, to appreciate the process, rather than just looking for the end result? When the time finally came to taste his creations, Jonathan looked proudly at the plate in front of him. The risotto wasn't perfect. It was a little more al dente than it should have been. But it was his. He had created it with his own hands. "Moment of truth," Jamal said, taking a spoonful into his mouth. His eyes widened in surprise. "Wow, Johnny, this is really good." Jonathan tasted his own risotto and couldn't hold back a satisfied smile. It was good. Not perfect, but surprisingly tasty. "You know," Jonathan said between mouthfuls, "I think I understand now why people like to cook so much. There's something rewarding about it." Jamal nodded, his face lighting up with a smile. "It's about creating something with your own hands, sharing it with others. It's a form of connection." As they finished their meal, Jonathan found himself thinking about all the business meals he'd had over the years. Expensive dinners in starred restaurants where the food was more a work of art than nourishment. But none of those meals compared to the satisfaction he felt now, eating something he had prepared himself alongside a friend. "So," Jamal asked, wiping the last grain of rice from his plate, "what did you think of our first wish list adventure?" Jonathan looked around the kitchen, at the used pans, at his sauce-stained apron, and at Jamal's smiling face. He felt a wave of gratitude and joy that he hadn't experienced for years. "I think it was perfect," he replied sincerely. "And you know what? I can't wait for the next item on the list." Jamal laughed, a sound full of life and promise. "Well, how about we jump into something a bit more exciting next time? I hear there's a great place to parachute a few hours from here." For a moment, Jonathan felt a twinge of fear. Jumping out of an airplane, he who had always prized control and safety. But then, looking at the risotto he had just prepared, something that would also have seemed impossible just a few hours ago, he felt a surge of courage. "You know what, Jamal," he said, a glint of determination in his eyes. "Let's do this." As they walked out of the market, back to the hospital, Jonathan felt different. He had tasted something new, not just in cooking, but in life. And he was eager to see what else awaited him on this unexpected journey with his new friend. The sun was setting over Boston, casting a golden glow over the streets. For Jonathan Blackwell, it was as if a new day was just beginning. The hum of the plane's engine filled the air, competing with the rapid beating of Jonathan's heart. He looked out of the small window, watching the Massachusetts landscape turn into a mosaic of greens and browns below. Next to him, Jamal looked calm, almost excited. "Are you sure about this?" Jonathan shouted over the noise, his voice betraying a nervousness he rarely allowed others to see. Jamal smiled, his eyes shining with a mixture of adrenaline and joy. "Too late to turn back now, Johnny. Besides, weren't you the one who said you wanted to live longer?" Jonathan swallowed, remembering the conversation they'd had the night before. After the cooking class, they had spent hours discussing their lives, their regrets, and their fears. It was during this conversation that Jonathan admitted that his biggest regret was having lived such a cautious life, always prioritizing safety and control over experiences and emotions. The skydiving instructor, a man called Rick with the tan of someone who spends his life outdoors, approached them. "Okay, guys, we're approaching the jump zone. Remember your training and trust your equipment. Are you ready?" Jamal punched the air, clearly excited. "We were born ready, weren't we, Johnny?" Jonathan tried to smile, but he was sure it looked more like a grimace. He checked his parachute for the 10th time, his hands shaking slightly. As the plane approached the jump point, Jonathan felt a wave of panic. What was he doing? He was a businessman, not an adventurer. His life had always been about calculating risks, not embracing them. As if reading his thoughts, Jamal put a hand on his shoulder. "Hey, remember what we talked about yesterday? About living every moment as if it were your last?" Jonathan nodded, remembering Jamal's words about how his illness had taught him to value every experience, every emotion. "Well," Jamal continued, "this is one of those moments. Don't think, just feel." The airplane door opened, letting in a gust of cold air. Rick signaled that it was time. Jamal went first. With a cry of joy, he launched himself into the void, disappearing in seconds. Jonathan froze in the doorway, his body refusing to move. All his instincts were screaming at him to back off, to return to the safety of the plane. But then something changed. Perhaps it was the memory of Jamal's laughter, or the memory of all the opportunities he had passed up in life. Whatever the reason, Jonathan felt a wave of determination wash over him. With a cry that was half fear, half elation, he jumped. The wind roared in his ears, the earth swirled beneath him, and Jonathan was sure he was about to die. As his body stabilized in free fall, the fear began to give way to a sensation that Jonathan hadn't experienced since childhood. Pure and simple joy. Really flying. The world was opening up below him in a spectacle of colors and shapes, and for the first time in decades, Jonathan felt truly free. When it came time to open the parachute, he was almost disappointed. The fabric opened above him with a snap, slowing his fall and allowing him to enjoy the view from a new perspective. Floating gently towards the ground, Jonathan spotted Jamal, who had already landed and was waving enthusiastically. When his feet finally touched the ground, Jonathan was laughing, a deep, genuine laugh that came straight from his soul. Jamal ran up to him, wrapping him in a tight hug. "You did it, man. You really did it." "I did," Jonathan replied, still out of breath. "I really did it." As they removed the equipment, Jonathan couldn't stop smiling. He felt alive, really alive, in a way he couldn't remember feeling in years. "You know," he said to Jamal as they walked back to the car, "I think I finally understand what you mean about living in the moment." Jamal smiled, patting his friend on the back. "That's what I'm talking about, Johnny. Life is too short to stay stuck in our comfort zones. Sometimes you have to throw yourself into the unknown to really feel alive." As they drove back to Boston, the sun setting over the horizon, Jonathan reflected on the day. He had faced his fear, challenged his limits, and, in the process, rediscovered a part of himself that he thought he had lost a long time ago. "So," Jamal asked with a mischievous grin, "what's next on our list?" Jonathan laughed, feeling light and full of possibilities. "You know what? I think I'm ready for anything." And for the first time in a long time, he really was. The man who got on that plane was not the same as the one who had jumped off it. Jonathan Blackwell had changed, and he couldn't wait to see where this new version of himself would take him next. The morning sun cast a golden glow over the streets of Dorchester, a Boston neighborhood Jonathan Blackwell had never imagined visiting. He was sitting in the passenger seat of Jamal's old Chevrolet, watching the modest houses and familiar stores pass by the window. "Welcome to my world, Johnny," Jamal said with a smile, guiding the car down familiar streets. "It's not Park Avenue, but it has its charm." Jonathan nodded, absorbing every detail. Children played basketball on makeshift courts. Old people chatted on weathered balconies, and the aroma of various ethnic dishes filled the air. "It's vibrant," Jonathan commented, surprised by the energy of the place. Jamal laughed. "Wait until you see the park. That's where we're having our community barbecue." When they arrived at Franklin Park, Jonathan was impressed by the activity. Dozens of people were already there, setting up tables, lighting barbecues, and hanging colorful decorations. "Jamal!" a strong, warm voice called out. A robust, middle-aged woman approached, hugging Jamal tightly. "My boy, it's been a long time." "Aunt Rosie," Jamal replied, returning the hug. "This is my friend Jonathan." Rosie looked at Jonathan, her eyes shining with curiosity and warmth. "Welcome to the family, darling. I hope you're hungry." Before Jonathan could reply, he found himself dragged into the middle of the action. Rosie put him to work, handing him a pile of plates to distribute. The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of activity. Jonathan, used to delegating tasks, now found himself lighting barbecues, chopping vegetables, and even attempting to flip burgers, under Rosie's close supervision. As the day progressed, the park filled with laughter, music, and the irresistible aroma of grilled food. Jonathan watched, fascinated, as people of all ages and backgrounds mingled, sharing stories and meals. "Hey, Johnny!" Jamal called out, handing him a plate overflowing with food. "Try this. It's Aunt Rosie's famous barbecue." Jonathan tasted it hesitantly, but his eyes widened at the flavor. As they ate, sitting on a bench in the park, Jamal began to tell stories about his childhood. He talked about the summers he had spent in that very park, about the life lessons he had learned on the streets of Dorchester, and about the community that had always supported him. "You know," Jonathan said after a moment's reflection, "I grew up thinking I had it all. But listening to your stories, I see that maybe I missed out on something fundamental." Jamal looked at him, curious. "What?" "Connection," Jonathan replied. "True human connection." Just then, a group of children approached, asking Jamal to play basketball with them. He looked at Jonathan with a challenging smile. "What do you say, Johnny? Ready for some action on the court?" Jonathan hesitated. "I haven't played basketball since college." "Time to brush up on your skills, then." On the makeshift court, Jonathan felt clumsy at first, but as the game progressed, he found himself laughing, running, and even scoring a few points. The children treated him as if he were just another member of the group, without caring who he was outside that court. As the sun began to set, Jonathan was exhausted, sweaty, but inexplicably happy. Sitting back with Jamal, watching the families say goodbye and the park lights come on, he felt at peace. "Jamal," he said softly, "thank you for this, for showing me all of this." Jamal smiled, patting his friend on the back. "That's what life is all about, Johnny. Not how much you have, but how much you share." As they prepared to leave, Aunt Rosie approached, carrying a box of food. "For you to take," she insisted, handing it to Jonathan. "And don't forget to come back, you hear? You're always welcome here." Jonathan felt a lump in his throat. "Thank you," he managed to say, "for everything." On the way back to the hospital, Jonathan remained silent, processing everything he had experienced. When he finally spoke, his voice was full of emotion. "You know, Jamal, I've spent my whole life building walls around myself. I thought that was how you achieved success. But today I saw what really matters." Jamal smiled, his eyes shining in the dark. "It's never too late to break down those walls, Johnny. It's never too late to start really living." As the car snaked through the streets of Boston, Jonathan looked out of the window, seeing the city with new eyes. He had arrived in Dorchester as a stranger, but he was leaving with a full heart and a new perspective on what it really meant to be rich. And for the first time in years, Jonathan Blackwell felt truly at home. The hospital room was silent, except for the soft beeping of the machines and the distant sound of the city outside. Jonathan was sitting on his bed, absent-mindedly leafing through a business magazine, when Jamal entered, pushing his wheelchair. "Hey, Johnny," Jamal called out, his face lit up with a smile, despite the obvious tiredness in his eyes. "Ready for our next adventure?" Jonathan looked up, immediately noticing the pallor on his friend's face. "Jamal, are you okay? You look a bit down." Jamal made a dismissive gesture with his hand. Just a bad night. Nothing a bit of fresh air won't fix. And speaking of which, I have a surprise for you." Before Jonathan could protest, Jamal was already pulling a backpack out from behind his chair. "Remember that item on our list about seeing the sunrise from a hot air balloon? Well, guess what?" Jonathan's eyes widened. "You didn't?" "Oh, yes, I did," Jamal laughed. "We have a reservation for tomorrow morning, but first, we need something special." With a theatrical flourish, Jamal pulled 2 old cameras out of his backpack. "Movie cameras," he explained, "because some memories deserve more than a simple digital click." Jonathan picked up one of the cameras, turning it over in his hands. It was heavy, solid, so different from the high-tech devices he was used to. "I haven't used one of these since, well, ever." "Exactly," Jamal smiled. "It's time to capture a few moments the old-fashioned way. Come on, we've got a sunset to photograph before our big flight." Despite his concerns about Jamal's state of health, Jonathan found himself being dragged out of the hospital. They found a quiet spot in a nearby park, overlooking the Boston skyline. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Jonathan found himself struggling with the camera. "How does this really work?" he muttered, frustrated. Jamal laughed, stepping in to help. "Here, let me show you. It's about feeling the moment, you know? It's not just about pointing and clicking. It's about capturing the essence of what you see." With Jamal's patient guidance, Jonathan started taking pictures. At first, his images were clumsy, out of focus, but as the night progressed, he began to see the world through the lens in a different way. "Look at that couple over there." Jamal pointed to a pair of elderly people walking hand in hand. "See how the light surrounds them? It's as if the universe itself is celebrating their love." Jonathan captured the image, feeling an unexpected emotion as he did so. It wasn't just a photo. It was a moment, a story, a whole life captured in a single frame. As the sky darkened, they continued photographing. Children playing, birds flying, the city lights coming on one by one. Each click of the shutter seemed to tell a different story. "You know," Jonathan said, putting the camera down for a moment, "I've spent my whole life looking at spreadsheets and reports. I've never really looked at the world this way." Jamal smiled, his face lit up by the last ray of sunshine. "That's why we're here, Johnny. To see the world with new eyes, to capture not just images, but moments, emotions, lives." When night finally fell, they sat down on a bench, exhausted but satisfied. Jonathan looked at Jamal, noticing how his friend seemed more fragile in the twilight. "Jamal," he began hesitantly, "are you sure you're okay for tomorrow's flight? If you need to rest." Jamal put a hand on Jonathan's shoulder. "Hey, don't worry about me. Some days are harder than others, but that only makes every moment more precious. I wouldn't miss our balloon adventure for the world." Jonathan nodded, feeling a mixture of admiration and concern for his friend. "You're amazing, you know, the way you face all this." "I'm not amazing," Jamal replied with a soft smile. "I've just learned to cherish every moment. And speaking of which, we have a sunrise to capture tomorrow. We'd better get some rest." As they walked back to the hospital, Jonathan found himself looking at the city with new eyes. Every street, every building, every person he passed seemed to tell a story. That night, lying in his hospital bed, Jonathan held the camera close to his chest. It wasn't just an object. It was a portal to a new way of seeing the world. And tomorrow, floating above the city at sunrise, he was determined to capture not just images, but moments that would last forever in his soul. The sky was still dark when Jonathan and Jamal arrived at the takeoff field on the outskirts of Boston. The early morning air was fresh and full of anticipation. In the distance, a huge ball of colorful fabric was beginning to take shape, slowly inflating against the lightening sky. "Ready to touch the sky, Johnny?" Jamal asked, his face lit up with a smile, despite the dark circles evident under his eyes. Jonathan nodded, feeling a mixture of anxiety and excitement. "As ready as I can be," he replied, adjusting the camera strap around his neck. The pilot of the balloon, a stout man called Mike, welcomed them with an enthusiastic wave. "Good morning, gentlemen. Ready for the best view Boston has to offer?" As Mike explained the safety procedures, Jonathan couldn't help noticing how Jamal seemed to struggle to stay on his feet. "Are you sure you're okay for this?" he whispered to his friend. Jamal gave a weak but determined smile. "I've never been better, Johnny. Some things are worth it, no matter the cost." Before Jonathan could argue, they were invited into the balloon basket. The heat from the burner warmed their faces as the balloon began to rise slowly off the ground. As they gained altitude, the world below them began to shrink. The lights of the city twinkled like fallen stars, and the horizon began to be tinged with the first pink and orange hues of dawn. Jonathan raised his camera, trying to capture the majesty of the moment. Next to him, Jamal did the same, his eyes shining with a mixture of joy and admiration. "Look, Johnny," Jamal pointed to the east. "It's starting." The sun began to rise over the horizon, a disk of fire that painted the sky in impossible colors. The clouds below them looked like an ocean of golden cotton, and for a moment, Jonathan felt as if they were floating in a completely different world. "It's indescribable," Jonathan murmured, lowering the camera for a moment to simply absorb the view. Jamal smiled, his face bathed in the golden light of dawn. "You know, Johnny, I've spent my whole life looking at the sky, dreaming of moments like this. And now, being here, it's like I can touch infinity." As the balloon floated gently over the ever-changing landscape, Jonathan and Jamal alternated between taking photos and simply marveling at the view. Below them, Boston was awakening, the streets coming to life as the day began. "It's funny," Jonathan reflected, looking out over the city he thought he knew so well. From above, everything seems so small. All those things we thought were so important. Jamal nodded, understanding. "That's why sometimes we need to gain perspective, Johnny, to remember what really matters." As the flight continued, Jonathan noticed that Jamal looked increasingly tired, leaning heavily on the side of the basket. Concerned, he approached his friend. "Jamal, are you okay? You look like you need to sit down." Jamal tried to smile, but it was clear that he was struggling. "Just a bit dizzy. I think the altitude." Before he could finish his sentence, Jamal staggered, his eyes rolling. Jonathan caught him before he fell, panic taking over. "Mike!" Jonathan shouted to the pilot. "We need to get down, now!" The next few minutes passed in a blur. The balloon descended quickly, landing in an open field. Paramedics, who had been called by Mike's radio, were already waiting when they touched the ground. Jonathan watched helplessly as Jamal was placed on a stretcher and taken to an ambulance. All he could do was drive on, his heart heavy with fear and worry. At the hospital, the hours dragged by. Jonathan paced back and forth in the waiting room, the images of the sunrise still fresh in his mind, contrasting painfully with the cold reality of the hospital corridor. Finally, a doctor appeared. "Mr. Blackwell, your friend is stable now. His illness, well, it's progressing faster than we expected." Jonathan felt as if the ground had disappeared from under his feet. Will he be all right?" The doctor hesitated. "We're doing everything we can. But his time may be shorter than we first thought." As the doctor continued to speak, Jonathan found himself looking at the camera in his hands. The photos they had taken, the moments they had shared, suddenly, everything seemed infinitely precious. Sitting down heavily in a chair, Jonathan held the camera against his chest. He had climbed into the sky this morning, touched the clouds and seen the world from a new perspective. But now, Back on the ground, he realized a painful truth. Sometimes the most precious moments are those that pass too quickly, leaving us with only memories and the harsh reality of time slipping through our fingers. The hospital room was silent, except for the soft beeping of the machines. Jonathan was sitting next to Jamal's bed, watching his friend sleep. The last 48 hours had been a roller coaster of emotions, going from the euphoria of the heights of the balloon to the anguish of the waiting room. Jamal stirred slightly, his eyes slowly opening. "Hey, Johnny," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "I guess I ruined our adventure, huh?" Jonathan felt a lump in his throat. "Don't say that. You didn't spoil anything." With visible effort, Jamal got into bed. "The photos. Did we get any good ones?" Jonathan picked up the cameras from the bedside table. "We haven't developed them yet. I thought we could do it together." A faint smile lit up Jamal's face. "That's a great idea. But first, there's something I need to ask you." Jonathan leaned forward, anxious. "Anything, Jamal. Whatever you need." Jamal took a deep breath, gathering his strength. "Remember my son? I want to see him. One last time." The request hit Jonathan like a punch in the stomach. One last time. The reality of the situation hit him full force. "Of course," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'll arrange everything. Where is he?" "Chicago," Jamal replied, "with his mother. I haven't seen him in, well, a long time." Jonathan nodded, determination replacing his initial shock. "Consider it done. I'll make the necessary calls right away." Over the next few hours, Jonathan mobilized all his resources. Calls were made, favors were called in, and in record time, a plan was hatched. A private jet would be ready to take them to Chicago as soon as Jamal received medical clearance. While they waited, Jonathan and Jamal spent time developing the photos they had taken. Each image brought up memories and emotions, from the sunset in the park to the sunrise from the balloon. "Look at this one," Jamal said, holding up a photo of the Boston skyline bathed in golden morning light. "It's like the whole city is waking up just for us." Jonathan smiled, remembering the moment. It was magical, wasn't it? Like we were floating in a dream. As they went through the photos, the conversation flowed naturally into deeper memories and reflections. "You know, Johnny," Jamal said, his voice charged with emotion, "before I met you, I was getting ready to give up. I thought I'd lived all I could. But you showed me that there was still so much to experience, so much to feel." Jonathan felt tears forming in his eyes. "Jamal, it was you who taught me how to really live. I existed, but I didn't live. You showed me what really matters." Jamal smiled, reaching out to take Jonathan's hand. "I think we saved each other, didn't we?" At that moment, the doctor entered the room. "Mr. Washington, Mr. Blackwell, we have good news. Jamal is stable enough for the trip. You can leave for Chicago tomorrow morning." The news brought a mixture of relief and anxiety. The trip to Chicago represented both hope and a painful reminder of how little time remained. The next morning, as they prepared to leave, Jonathan noticed Jamal looking thoughtfully out of the hospital window. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. Jamal turned around, his eyes shining with a mixture of emotions. "I'm thinking about all the things I want to say to my son, all the lessons I want to pass on, all the moments I've missed, and I wonder if I'll have enough time." Jonathan put a comforting hand on his friend's shoulder. "You will. And you know what? We're going to document everything, every moment, every word. That way, your son will always have a piece of you with him." Jamal nodded, gratitude evident on his face. "Thank you, Johnny, for everything." As they left the hospital for the airport, Jonathan reflected on the journey they had shared. From strangers in adjoining hospital rooms to inseparable friends, united by experiences that transcended their differences. On the plane, as Boston fell behind, Jonathan made a silent promise. He would make sure that Jamal's last adventure was the most meaningful of all, not just for Jamal and his son, but as a testament to the transformative power of friendship and the priceless value of every moment lived to the full. As the plane gained altitude, Jonathan looked at Jamal, who was sleeping peacefully beside him. He knew that whatever the future held, the moments they had shared and the lessons they had learned would live on forever. A constant reminder that the true richness of life lies in the connections we make and the experiences we share. The plane landed gently at Chicago's O'Hare International Airport. Jonathan looked at Jamal, who was awake but visibly anxious. "Ready?" Jonathan asked gently. Jamal nodded, a mixture of fear and expectation in his eyes. "As ready as I can be." They left the airport in a limousine that Jonathan had arranged. The city of Chicago stretched out before them, imposing and vibrant. Jamal stared out of the window, absorbing every detail, as if it were the first and last time. "He's waiting for us at Millennium Park," Jamal said softly. "I thought it would be a good place. Neutral." Jonathan agreed, feeling the weight of the moment. When they arrived at the park, he helped Jamal out of the car, keeping close in case his friend needed support. A young man of about 20, with the same expressive eyes as Jamal, was standing near the famous sculpture, the Bean. At the sight of Jamal, the young man froze, a mixture of emotions crossing his face. "Dad?" he called out, his voice trembling. "Michael," Jamal replied, tears already streaming down his face. The two approached slowly, years of distance and hurt hanging between them. Then, as if an invisible barrier had been broken, they embraced, muffled sobs echoing in the air. Jonathan moved away discreetly, giving them privacy. He walked over to the Bean, looking at his distorted reflection in the metal surface. How many times in his life had he felt like this, a deformed version of himself, lost in a world he didn't fully understand? After a few minutes, Jamal called out to him. Jonathan approached, noticing the red eyes of father and son, but also the relief and love evident on their faces. "Johnny, this is my son, Michael," Jamal introduced. "Michael, this is Jonathan, the man who made this meeting possible." Michael held out his hand, gratitude in his eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwell. You don't know how much this means to us." The three of them spent the rest of the day together, walking through the park, talking, and most importantly, listening. Jamal shared stories of his youth, lessons he had learned, and dreams he had for Michael. As the sun began to set, tinting the Chicago sky with shades of orange and pink, they sat on a bench overlooking Lake Michigan. "Michael," Jamal said, his voice tired but determined, "I know I wasn't the father you deserved, but I want you to know that I've always loved you, and I always will. And even when I'm no longer here, I want you to live each day to the full, enjoy every moment." Michael nodded, tears in his eyes. "I love you, Dad. And I forgive you." Jonathan, feeling the intensity of the moment, picked up his camera. "Can I take a picture of the two of you?" Father and son smiled, embracing. The click of the shutter captured the moment, a moment of reconciliation, forgiveness, and unconditional love. That evening back at the hotel, Jamal looked exhausted but at peace. "Thank you, Johnny," he said, "for everything." Jonathan felt a lump in his throat. "No, Jamal, I'm the one who thanks you. You've taught me more about life and love in the last few weeks than I've learned in my entire existence." The next morning, they were preparing to return to Boston when they received a surprise visit. Michael appeared in their hotel room carrying a photo album. "I found these in Mom's belongings," he explained. "They're photos of you, Dad, from when you were young. I thought maybe we could add some new ones." The three of them spent the morning looking through the old photos and adding the new ones that Jonathan and Jamal had taken on their adventures. It was a fusion of past and present, a bridge between generations. When it was time to leave, the hugs were long and emotional. Promises were made to keep in touch, to continue building the relationship that had been repaired. On the flight back to Boston, Jamal was quiet, reflective. "You know, Johnny," he finally said when I got my diagnosis, "I thought it was the end, but now I see that it was just the beginning of something new." Jonathan nodded, understanding deeply. "You showed me that too, Jamal. You've given me a new perspective on life." When they arrived at the hospital in Boston, they were greeted with surprising news. Jamal's latest tests showed an unexpected improvement. It wasn't a cure, but it offered more time, precious time, that they both knew would be made the most of. That evening, sitting on the hospital terrace, looking out at the lights of Boston, Jonathan and Jamal made plans for more adventures, for more meaningful moments, for living each day as if it were their last and their first. "So, Johnny," Jamal asked with a smile, "what's next on our list?" Jonathan smiled back, feeling an emotion he couldn't name, a mixture of gratitude, love, and hope. "Whatever you want, my friend. The world is ours." As the sun set over Boston, painting the sky with colors that rivaled any photo they had taken, Jonathan reflected on the journey he had shared with Jamal. He had entered that hospital room months ago as a lost man, focused only on numbers and material success. Now he came out transformed, with a new understanding of what really mattered in life. And while the future remained uncertain, one thing was clear: every day, every moment, was a precious gift. A gift that, thanks to Jamal, Jonathan now knew how to truly appreciate. The chapter of their lives that was ending was not an end, but a new beginning. And together, they were ready to write many more pages in this story of friendship, growth, and the beauty of living fully. What would you do if you had the chance to live more intensely, even for a short time? What dreams have you not yet realized? The question remains: is life a race against time, or a search for meaning? Don't forget to leave a comment and share your own aspirations. After all, each of us has a list to accomplish. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment your thoughts. Your participation is very important to us. See you next time.